Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest and great friend of the podcast, Doomberg. If you didn't catch our last episode together, and that's highly unlikely as it is our most downloaded show ever, check it out. It has some more context on who exactly this green chicken mystery person might be, and some of their views on content creation, and of course, so much more. For those of you who don't yet subscribe to the Doomberg Substack, which has the hottest of hot takes on energy, heavy industry, supply chains, geopolitics, and more, get on that. But today we're going to jump into your most recent piece, hot off the press, Farmers on the Brink. But first, how you been, Doomberg?
Hey, Dr. Kiefer, it's great to be back with you, and been very much enjoying this series of outstanding podcasts that you've published. And we were talking beforehand that I just listened to the one you published this morning with Lee Gehring, and you're really on a hot streak. And it's a real pleasure to be back to talk about this piece that we just published, and looking forward to always intellectually challenging and interesting discussion. So I enjoyed my first appearance, and I have every expectation that this one will be just as much fun as that one.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, as you were saying, we just had Lee Gehring on, and something he said that I think fits really well into your piece is that essentially we've had 20 years of relatively good agricultural growing conditions. You know, by and large, the weather's been pretty cooperative with a few little small exceptions, but nothing on a kind of global scale. But you know, he warned of sort of a black swan event in the making. And you know, you start this piece off talking about the perfect storm, and it seems to be a mix of the energy crisis, the Russian invasion sanctions, and COVID supply chain disruptions, and the Great Resignation. That's a lot to get into. So you know, I'm going to let you take it away from here. But where's a good place to start?
I think a good place to start is, in fact, with a perfect storm, which, as we say in the piece, is often an overused, descriptor of events. But as it pertains to what we see going on in global agriculture, which is something I'm sure we'll get into, because what will happen in Canada and the United States is probably different than what will transpire in the rest of the world. But really, what we're seeing is a perfect storm in price escalations and/or shortages of supply for key inputs into farming. And one of the points that we make in the piece is, in a traditional financial crisis, one of the things that makes a financial crisis a crisis is that the correlation of seemingly unrelated asset classes tends to converge to one all at the same time. And so there is no safe haven in a crisis. And we're seeing a similar phenomenon, we believe, in the inputs into what is necessary to convert sunlight into food, the agricultural sector. And before we wrote this piece, we had spent a couple of weeks crisscrossing the U.S. Midwest, consulting with our contacts in the agricultural space, with farmers, with people who work at, commodity brokerage houses, getting a sense for whether what we were seeing on our Bloomberg terminal was being reduced to practice in the field and with the farmers. And we were kind of spooked by what we found. And the perfect storm actually happened over Halloween weekend, which is how we started the piece. And it led into what we found. And I'm happy to walk through, sort of at a high level, the main conclusions of the piece, unless you wanted to take them one at a time.
I mean, honestly, I'm gonna leave it in your hands. I just think a good place to start. I think it's something Alex Epstein said, which was basically fossil fuels are the food of food. And I think your piece did a pretty stellar job at laying that out. But I mean, take it from there. I mean, energy crisis seems like a good place to start, but it's your piece. I just want to shine some light on it.
Sure. So we began with fertilizer, and something we've written about and we talked about when we were on your show the last time. But the price of fertilizer continues to skyrocket, and fertilizer is essentially stored energy from fossil fuels. As you know, ammonia comes from natural gas, effectively directly through the Haber process. Potassium, potash is from mining, and you can't mine without diesel and fossil fuels. And phosphates, of course, also come from mining, and just the refining of those minerals requires an enormous amount of energy. And today, that energy comes from the prime fossil fuels like oil and natural gas. And so what we're seeing is this convergence of, accelerated, of course, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has completely thrown lots of previous economic assumptions into the dustbin, and we have to reconsider the world as it presents itself today. Russia and Belarus and Ukraine, many people focus on sort of the wheat exports. That's fine, and that's an issue. But in reality, the biggest challenge we think for the food supply is the amount of fertilizer that those countries produce, and our inability to get those fertilizers today because of shipping restrictions, economic sanctions, you name it. But like potash, for example, is something like 40% of the supply comes from that area, and you can't knock 40% of a highly inelastic commodity like that offline without seeing skyrocketing prices. And we're seeing that today across the board. And to the extent that North American farmers were wise enough to pre-buy what they needed to cover this year's planting season, that's all well and good. And we suspect that for many farmers here in North America, that's the case. Certainly, some are caught short and are scrambling and have to respond to the doubling or tripling or quadrupling of the price of fertilizer. But there's a whole pantheon of countries for whom they live. That's cash-based business, and the cash in the tin pays for the supplies that go to the field today, and they're going to be in the hurt locker, and they contribute to global food trade in a big way, and the social stability of those countries is in serious jeopardy. But then we drilled down a little bit further, which is a topic that isn't on a lot of people's radar, and we covered the situation in the herbicide market, and
Right.
we talked about glyphosate.
Yeah, this was super interesting. I wasn't thinking of, as when you read a lot of Doomberg, you learn about supply chains and you learn about feedstocks. And I had not put this one together in my head. So yeah, go ahead and take that away.
So glyphosate is it's a very controversial molecule. We know it from our time in industry, and we were reminded of the critical nature of it when we were doing our primary research with the farmers and the people in the ag sector that we know. And glyphosate is basically a chemically modified version of a fertilizer. It's downstream from ammonia. So the Chinese process to make glyphosate, for example, goes through glycerin, which is effectively a derivative of ammonia, and it has phosphorus in it. And so ultimately, the same phenomenon and shortages that are driving the price spike in fertilizer are leaking their way into herbicides. Now, I should say up front, glyphosate is a very controversial molecule. It's linked to lymphoma and other blood cancers. It was invented by Monsanto in the 70s, and there's a lot of controversy in the anti-GMO world because a lot of these seeds are modified. So you can get a Roundup Ready corn seed that allows you to splash glyphosate around your field, and it doesn't affect the corn plant, and that's great until it isn't. And there's resistance to glyphosate as a herbicide. Herbicides are designed to control the weeds in your field, and this is a real big deal for farmers. And obviously, glyphosate isn't the only option, but it's still the dominant molecule. It has, I think, a plurality of the share of herbicides, and the shortages of glyphosate and the doubling and tripling, quadrupling of the prices of glyphosate has caused a knock-on effect where other herbicides are in high demand, and people didn't plan for having to compensate for supply shortages in glyphosate or a big price spike like this. And so the prices are converging to utility as opposed to sort of supply-demand basics for any particular herbicide. So if you can control weeds, there's a price to that, and the price of glyphosate is the clearing price of that. And so it's the rising tide of all herbicides. And what that means is, skimping on herbicides for a season is doable, but it only makes the amount you'll need next year all the more challenging. And ultimately, as one of our trusted experts in the field who's helped us on a few pieces said to us, it only takes 1 year of negligence to do multiple years of damage to a field.
Right.
And once weeds get out of control, it can be a real challenge. But just to be clear, we're not endorsing the use of glyphosate or genetically modified seeds. It's just the reality of the state that presents itself in the agricultural sector.
I have to jump in for a second.
Sure.
Having done a little bit of a review of the medical literature on glyphosate, and the link is certainly there in the legal literature. The courtroom with 12 uneducated jurors has certainly awarded big settlements and established that link legally. But in terms of the the lab and epidemiological evidence, it's just not there.
Yeah, someday we'll come back and talk about BPA.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm quite familiar with the chasm between legal evidence and medical evidence,
Yeah,
but that's a topic for a different day
absolutely. Yeah.
and a completely different challenge, and one I'm more than happy to talk about. But for sure, glyphosate is not without its controversy, and genetically modified seeds, and it's not just glyphosate, but basically today, any sort of ag chemical company that also has a seeds division will try to co-market their seeds with their herbicides and fungicides and make them sort of tolerant to the application of those, which it makes it life easier on the farmer, and that's how things have evolved. Not many people understand that connection.
So we've covered like two pretty major issues here, right? I mean, the kind of chemical model of agriculture where you're just looking at these kind of elemental fertilizers like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You've explained those shortages. And then the chemicals needed to control weeds. As a little hobby farmer for a couple seasons, fucking hated weeding. The struggle is real, but as they say, I think on some advertisements. But wait, there's more. So hit us with this again, this perfect storm. There's a lot of factors coming together here.
And again, I think let me jump to the end. We take no pleasure in writing this piece, and we hope we're wrong. We ended the piece by saying that we've never been more certain that there would be a famine overseas as a consequence of both where we are and our reaction to it. We are sounding the alarm, trying not to be alarmist, which is a hard needle to thread. Right. And we certainly hope we're wrong. We would love nothing more than for this piece to look silly next year.
Right.
Because we're talking about real lives and potentially hundreds of millions of people in food jeopardy.
I mean, it's interesting because in terms of the areas being affected, and how that's likely to be patterned. I was reading a very interesting piece because there's been a lot of catastrophizing about Ukraine's exports being, interrupted by both, maybe a failure of the planting season with the war going on, and also the kind of destruction of their ports and the Black Sea being pretty much shut down, I think, for a lot of commercial shipping. But an author, Sarah Tabor. I'm planning on.
I think I may have gotten that 15 times via my DMs. I mean, nowhere in our piece did we talk about. No, I know.
It's just interesting. It's just interesting because it's not like the 25%. It's 1% of total wheat production. But the places in the world that depend on those exports are Middle East and North Africa, because a lot of populous countries like India and China, I guess, grow most of their own wheat. But Egypt, I remember being slammed really hard by high food prices.
And look, I don't disagree with her opinion, which is the actual supply of wheat in the short term can be compensated for, and probably will be. And that's why we don't cover it in our piece.
Right.
The things that alarm us have nothing to do with the short-term supply of final product. We're talking about the key inputs that are going in on a go-forward basis. And those are far more affected by Russia, Ukraine. I mean, the amount of fertilizer that is being taken offline is catastrophic, which is why you see Western European ammonia prices go up 33% on Friday before we record this.
Right.
And so, but I got sent that Twitter thread, which is a perfectly fine one and one that I find difficult to disagreeing with, in response to our piece, as though one had input or made clear the other, like we weren't talking about. And so it's just funny, but so I've seen that, but is what it is. So the next thing we covered in the piece is diesel, and we borrowed heavily from really great energy columnist from Bloomberg, Haber-Bosch, who does really great work and is a total must follow on Twitter. And he put out a piece on global diesel markets a couple of weeks ago that was very prescient. And basically what happens is, of course, people don't realize, I mean, diesel doesn't just appear. Diesel is a refined product of oil. And in order to refine oil into finished diesel, you need hydrogen. And the way you get hydrogen today is from natural gas, much like that's why you use hydrogen to make fertilizer. And so the spike in natural gas in Europe, Dutch TTF, or in Asia, JKM, has caused the economics of the refining of oil into diesel to be prohibitive for European refiners. And the price of diesel, wholesale at least, had skyrocketed. It has come down from the highs since Javier wrote that piece. But regardless, diesel is kind of a globally fungible commodity, and price at the pump in the U.S., for example, the retail price of diesel has passed $5 American per gallon, and these are real price increases on an important commodity. You need to run those tractors and the heavy machinery, and most of those farm equipments run on diesel. And if that European natural gas situation doesn't resolve itself quickly, Europe itself imports both finished diesel and the semi-processed oil precursor for it. And if things continue to dissolve with Putin's gambit to price energy products in rubles and Europe's desire to not do that, you could see a point where we begin to run out of diesel, or the price of diesel begins to skyrocket. And then from there, it's one thing to not be able to fuel your tractor or have it be more expensive to fuel your tractor. The same chip crisis that has struck the automotive industry has reared its ugly head into farming equipment. And so it's actually difficult to get new tractors and new machinery. But more importantly and more urgently, spare parts are hard to come by. And we profiled in the piece, there was a Republican farm roundtable where farmers were venting their frustrations with this perfect storm of inflation on their input costs. And one farmer that we quoted in the piece talked about waiting for a $40 emissions-related sensor for his tractor, and unsure of when it would arrive. And I'll quote directly from him: "I cannot drive that tractor, a $250,000 piece of equipment, because I cannot get that sensor." And our modern machinery is so sophisticated, and the emissions controls on those machines are so intricate, and our compliance with emissions regulations, which we're all for, everybody breathes the same air, are such that sometimes these heavy pieces of machinery literally get bricked if they're missing one sensor, and if those sensors are in short supply because of a chip crisis. It can be a real challenge. And then, of course, if you can't have the machines, then you need to increase the supply of labor, and there's a chronic shortage of labor across all industries. One of the charts that we showed in our piece is the growing disparity between open job positions in the U.S., which at last measure was over 11 million, and the number of unemployed but willing, searching for work Americans is just over 6 million, and that 5 million person gap is a real challenge that many industries are facing, and then in particular agriculture will have a real challenge because it's physical labor. It's not like the most pleasant work in the world, and also historically, a lot of that labor demand was satisfied by immigrant or migrant labor, and in the era of controlled border crossings because of vaccine mandates, for example, finding that labor and filling those roles is becoming a significant challenge. And then the last thing we talked about was something that our friend on Twitter, Tracy Sherwood, had been pointing out for a while, and she's at Chigirl, CHIGRL. She's been pointing out for many weeks now that the U.S. domestic supply of propane is at sort of alarmingly low levels, and propane is a critical input into farming during harvest season, because when you harvest, you have to dry these grains, and grain drying is pretty energy intense. The moisture content allows you to meet specifications, but also, frankly, it allows you to store it for longer and limit spoilage. The more damp your crops are, the quicker they are to spoil. And because many rural farms are not connected to natural gas pipelines, they rely on trucked in propane for running their grain dryers. And we're exiting the 2021-22 winter with the lowest supply that we can find in 7 years, according to the data we have on Bloomberg. And that's just like another challenge in this perfect storm of the convergence of all of these inputs correlating with each other and mooning at the same time.
And that propane shortage is happening in the North American context. I mean, that was kind of surprising to me, given that the U.S. has become such an oil and gas powerhouse. Is there something unique about propane that's limiting that supply?
I think we're doing a lot of exporting. So in fact, if you look at the natural gas stores for the U.S. coming out every week on Thursday, the U.S. Department of Energy publishes the how much natural gas we have relative to 5-year average and high-low. and we're coming out at some pretty low levels just for natural gas, and of course, propane and this flows from natural gas liquids, and sort of refining is too strong of a word, but separation technologies that allow you to isolate those, and so this same tug of global demand, and with Henry Hub natural gas trading at 550 today, whereas European natural gas is trading at 35. There's a strong desire to export as much as you can, and so all of these sort of seemingly unrelated factors are converging in the same way. But yeah, I would say that the U.S. natural gas storage numbers are a little alarming as well. We didn't get into that because it doesn't specifically impact farmers. But as we're speaking, I'm just pulling up the report from last week. So released on March 24th, the total U.S. weekly natural gas storage report pegs our current storage at 17% below the 5-year average and 21% below last year at this time. And so it's not at critical levels yet, but it does raise an eyebrow for sure.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of these impacts globally, and the regions that will be more affected, I mean, you've talked a lot about Europe being particularly affected, particularly with their natural gas inputs being so dependent on Russian gas, and the uncertainty there, the potential pricing in the ruble. I mean, certainly, I haven't looked at this in a while, but it seemed like gas flows to Europe from Russia were, especially in the early days of the war, higher than they'd been pre-war.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not able to turn that faucet off. But there's quite a bit of fertilizer made, or used to be, I guess, made in the EU from that imported gas, right?
Yes, and also from Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. So I have, we didn't get into too much of this in the piece because there's only so long a piece can be.
Mm-hmm.
But we believe that the U.S. and Canada, so I sort of draw a circle around NAFTA.
Right.
We will make do. We will be okay. Prices will be much higher. Farmers will be bailed out, compensated for any losses, and encouraged to produce. And the economically unfortunate among us will be taken care of. There will be some combination of charity and/or government stimulus to ensure that as few people as possible go hungry here. And look, we're all for that. I mean, who could be against it? Except the consequence of that is we will be exporting even more food inflation globally as we become the clearing price for these critical inputs. Whatever we need, we'll buy, price agnostic. And because we will be the global price setter, that will only further exacerbate the consequences for those countries that are today on or below the line. And I would take issue with not take issue, I would give you a slightly different interpretation on Europe. I thought it was important that the deal that Joe Biden struck while he was in Europe to effectively, it seems to be, to redirect current LNG exports from the U.S. Using just a free market and selling it to the highest bidder, to sort of have a preferential supply arrangement with Europe. And the thing that I haven't seen hardly anybody report on is included in that sort of agreement that was released as part of the press conference with Joe Biden and his peer from the European Union, whose name escapes me now, is that they would incorporate a blended price, including some sort of tie back to the Henry Hub price here in the U.S. because the price as it exists today and the mechanism for determining that price in the eyes of Europe is broken. The net result of this is it has to, you would think, come at the expense of Japan, Korea, China, and Southeast Asia. If the U.S. and Qatar, and I don't know where the Australians land on this, although the trade war between China and Australia probably doesn't help the Southeast Asian cause vis-a-vis Australian LNG exports. But if the U.S. and Qatar, who are, the sort of three great producers of LNG for export today, that's the U.S., Qatar, and Australia. If the U.S. and Qatar redirect their previous sort of free market activities towards Europe with a blended price, sort of privileged economics, let's call it, you would have to think that Japan and North Korea, our allies in Southeast Asia, would be the ones that suffer most. And so I don't know how they're going to sort of square the peg into the round hole here. But you can't have, if you have constrained supplies of LNG, you can't commit to sending more to Europe without cutting off the people that were buying it before, because it's not like in the time frames that matter, we're going to be able to suddenly snap our fingers and have materially higher LNG export capacity. These are multi-billion-dollar projects that take years to permit and build. So I'm not sure Europe will be the biggest loser in this. It could be based on what we saw coming out of Europe last week and this commitment to create a blended price for LNG that includes some reference to Henry Hub. It could be that Asia's the big loser in this.
Interesting. Yeah. No, it was one of the thoughts that crossed my mind in reading your piece is, and it's coming out of my context as well, where we're going to be likely closing one of our huge nuclear plants and replacing it with natural gas. And we only really use natural gas for peaking right now, where I'm at in Ontario, because we have so much nuclear, but we're going to be burning it as baseload. And I mean, it's not biofuels. It's not quite, burning food, but when there's a shortage and a crunch on natural gas, in a sense it is, right? Because this is such a vital feedstock. And I think about every, nuclear plant that's been shut in Germany, for instance, and their reliance on
Yeah.
natural gas instead. And it really starts to, when you start thinking about global food shortages and, the most disadvantaged among us, the wretched of the earth, we're going to bear the brunt of these food shocks or food stresses. It just adds a whole other layer of I don't know what.
Well,
it's
I mean, in a hat tip to you, it's funny what goes viral on Twitter. It's something I wish I understood better, but we retweeted something just as sort of one of those classic Bloomberg headlines, and the headline is Germany's Chancellor Scholz. I do not believe keeping Germany's nuclear power plants running would help.
Right.
So this is the headline, right? And we retweeted it with 3 simple words: more pain required. And that tweet, I was just looking at it now, has 1,500 likes, and I might tweet 100 tweets and not get a tweet,
Right.
have that kind of response. But it's such a simple thing, but it's very clear to us.
Well, they're
that,
insulated
the answer
they're
is
insulated from so much of that pain
yeah.
because they're a wealthy country. But it's like
And he in particular is a wealthy person in that
Right.
country. Yeah, I bet that those on the edge in Germany aren't too happy with that tweet either. But you're correct, and we need to see far more pain before people get serious. And we close the piece, that we've gotten together to talk about today, with a bit of a call for our political leaders to open up a physics textbook once in a while. I mean, that would be great if they sort of could just understand. And I must say, look, I mean, I've learned a lot just from listening to your podcasts and the things I thought we knew versus the things we need to, maybe give a second look on. I've when we first talked, you sort of chastised me for my support of solar. I've done a lot more reading on it, and I'm open-minded to it. I still think distributed solar makes a lot of sense. And I actually do think politically it's just not going away. So if we're going to be doing solar, we ought to at least be putting polysilicon plants in Appalachia. But, you and I and your listeners are so far ahead of where the politicians and their belief systems are today that it's almost scary. Like the amount of pain that we need to see, which is inevitable, that will shock these people into opening up a physics textbook, I'm afraid is a lot more pain than people think might be coming.
Right. I tend to be a little bit of I'm not sure if catastrophist is the right term. I mean, when, working in healthcare and at the beginning of COVID and seeing, the catastrophes in Italy and then New York and waiting for it to come to Toronto, in my medical education hat, I was designing a lot of simulation courses, kind of almost like astronaut training in PPE, thinking that COVID was going to be like Ebola, for instance. That's an example of, I think, a tendency I have to really,
Sure.
maybe it's Eastern European as well. I think that it's kind of a thing where we prepare for the worst and then we can be pleasantly surprised sometimes. So I always try and have a bit of a cognitive forcing strategy to reevaluate. Again, catastrophe is probably the wrong word, but these kind of very
There is a technical phrase for this, right? You're familiar with the clinical diagnosis for the mild mental illness that you just described. It's called defensive pessimism.
Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's the Eastern.
You should look it up. It's a very common phenomenon
Yeah.
amongst people who think too much about certain things.
Right,
And I
right.
would characterize myself as deeply in your camp in that area. But yeah, you are a classic clinical, almost, pardon the pun, defensive pessimist for sure.
Dr. Doomberg diagnoses Dr. Kiefer. I love it. But what I was trying to get at there is the sort of cognitive forcing strategy, right? And I've had Lee Gehring on. I was, hugely impressed, and it's really very interesting talking to folks in the financial world and in the commodity investment world as well. I've seen, and this was again, I think, from Sarah Tabor's piece. Her critique was, people are panicking, people about shortages, and it's kind of advertising for price bubbles, and that commodities investors sort of have a vested interest in creating panic because it leads to a lot of volatility, and that might lead to them improving their bottom line. Do you think there's a component of that going on, or how would you respond to that kind of a criticism?
I would say that I would bucket that into the sort of same category of critiques. Well, let me phrase it this way. How do you sound the alarm without being alarmist? So
Right.
there are things we can do today that could bend that curve. And if we don't sound the alarm, then we will continue on the path we're on.
Mm-hmm.
And then the triggering of the panic that she's worried about will be a distinction without much of a difference because we're going to get to the end state anyway.
Mm-hmm.
We highly doubt that anybody, hardly anybody after reading our piece is going to go start hoarding food. It just, that piece was meant to alarm our policymakers more than it was to sort of quote, trigger a panic.
Right.
The analogy would be claiming that your liquidity is fine in the middle of a bank run. Like you're going to run out of money anyway. I understand that, but it's just sort of, I don't know. It's when you're in this position where you firmly believe, I firmly believe, we firmly believe at Doomberg that we are on the cusp of a global famine. The risk-benefit analysis of shutting up about it and quietly just preparing ourselves is tough to swallow. I would say we have a lot of influential people that read us. Hopefully, maybe we inform them a little bit. We've been invited on your show and a few other shows to talk about it. Ultimately, we will reach thermodynamic equilibrium, and I don't think a panic catalysis is going to somehow amplify that. We're going to end up in the same place we were going to end up roughly around the same time, unless we can actually have an intelligent conversation about, wow, these trends are converging and there's things we can intelligently do about it, like maybe not shut down our nuclear power plants in Germany, and that alone might be a market signal that we're not led by complete energy idiots.
Mm-hmm.
And that might cause some of the panic to subside. But yeah, I mean, there's a fine line to walk, and we try to walk it. That's all I can say.
Right. No, I mean, I think the energy crisis and the Russian aggression in Ukraine have, I had an episode I called "The Fog of Peace," and
it was wonderful. I loved it.
This idea that climate concern and climate action, at least as has been pursued up to this point, is very much a kind of luxury good of easy times, of cheap energy and cheap capital. And I mean, it's just so frustrating. And I mean, it's in terms of kind of who's to blame for the situation we've gotten into. I mean, I think Lee Gehring made a pretty sound argument in terms of on the supply side that ESG has seriously curtailed the investment cycle in terms of fossil fuels, and that we're hitting a real crunch, and there's not really an ability to get things going quickly. And of course, I mean, I'm a climate alarmist myself. I mean, I just think that hopefully I'm respecting physics a little more and pursuing the right approach here. But I mean, I used to have a much more simplistic outlook on fossil fuels. And I mean, your piece is part of this education, but just the vital role they play, and that we're not getting off them anytime soon. And we're critically dependent. And climate action, climate change, particularly, 80 years down the road is a huge fucking deal. But an energy crisis immediately is a huge fucking deal. Pardon my French.
And we would both agree that the path function really matters. And if you actually care about global warming and climate change, then you have to get it right, because never has the ESG movement been at more risk politically because of the path function that they chose, which is excluding nuclear from the equation, for example, and rushing renewables into a grid that was insufficiently stable to receive them. And as your guest on the Fog of Peace episode sort of articulated in a way I hadn't really thought about it before, but the sort of entropic penalty imposed upon the other inputs into the grid sort of net out the benefit potentially when you do the full analysis, which, back to our conversation about solar, is something I want to do a little bit more thinking about before I sort of confirm for sure where my new thoughts are. But it was certainly very interesting and very thoughtful. And by the way, thoughtful debate is in fact necessary for these things. And again, to the extent that we tried to provoke people into thinking about the challenge, the urgent challenge that we see on a global basis, that the piece we published on Saturday hopefully contributed to that. But again, the most frustrating part about the criticism of the piece is the implication that we were implying that the U.S. would have a food shortage. The U.S. is going to have a food inflation problem. The rest of the world is going to have a food shortage, and we laid that in black and white in the piece. And as I was talking to you before we got on, I'm happy to defend what we wrote. I can't defend what you read.
I have to, I was giving you a hard time on the solar front on the last episode, but something you said earlier in this recording caught my attention, which was you were saying something about genetic engineering, and that it's not necessarily something that you endorse at Doomberg. Or could you clarify that statement? Because I mean, we're a very sort of.
So I would say, let me be very clear.
Yeah, please
I'm
do.
very pro genetically modified seeds.
Yeah.
And I do think that the anti-GMO movement is insane. And if I misspoke earlier, let me clarify it. But the modification of seeds for the use of particular chemicals that may or may not have a toxicity profile that is either damaging to humans or the environment is a different deal altogether. And so I like drought-tolerant seeds. If new pesticides and fungicides can be invented that have a much safer profile than the ones we've used historically, modifying the seeds to be resistant to those so that they can be applied liberally, we're all for. So I want to be very, very clear that you can't be pro-human and anti-GMO.
Yeah. No, glad to clarify that. Yeah, I mean, it's something I think about frequently is just, and it's unfortunate.
People have shocking ignorance on the topic. Yeah, there's no other way to say it. Yeah.
No, and I mean, just I call it sort of this rearguard action that I feel like I'm constantly battling environmentalists and green folks because they're just so diametrically opposed, I think, to what is needed for effective climate action, but also just this Malthusianism, which I think there's no clearer case than if we are facing into a global famine. I mean, that is kind of Malthusianism at work, and it's all caught up in this eco-romantic fairy tale that we can stop innovating and we can sort of dial back time and go to simpler ways. But it's every technology creates a new set of problems that need to be solved, and they need to be solved with new technology and innovation, right? Like
you could do that with far less people.
There we go.
Per Alex Epstein's point.
Right.
Like, don't get me wrong. Like, again, there are farming practices that are very bad for the environment today that they should be fixed. GMO is very low on the list. And in fact, GMO is probably responsible for more people being better fed than almost any other technology in the history of humankind. I mean, we have, if you just look at the productivity per acre benefits of modern seed technology, it's incredible. But the point earlier that I was making, like, for example, nitrate runoff in fields does lead to selenium leaching, which leads to reproductive issues with certain small, with certain fish, and these are really issues that we should be mindful of, and we should be aware of how our farming practices, have long-term impacts on soil quality and so on. But I agree with you that by and large, the problems that are derived from technology can be solved with technology, and the sort of straight line up of bushels per acre yields in the sort of modern world are proof positive that ultimately this benefits more people than it hurts.
Well, I mean, who would have thought that India of all countries? I mean, if you'd said that in the 70s, that India would potentially be filling the void of Ukrainian exports to keep Middle East and North Africa fed. I mean, that's wild, and that's totally
for a season.
Yeah. Okay.
For a season.
But still.
Yes, I agree. And look, ultimately, I think we're both optimists in the long run, but we are heading into a period where if we don't begin to act smartly now, we won't be able to bend the curve later. And that's really the thrust of the piece. And in fact, we're also going to publish another piece this week that has sort of nothing to do with energy and more to do with finance, just to sort of clean the palate, cleanse the palate a little bit. And we don't want to just write pieces like that, but that was a really important piece for us to write. We're proud of it. We believe every word. We stand by every word. Happy to defend what we wrote. And it's done incredibly well. And the feedback has been mostly positive for every critique we've gotten, we have probably gotten 50 emails from farmers thanking us for highlighting these issues because they're dealing with it, especially small farmers. They're dealing it if they don't have like global procurement teams getting the very best price and sourcing from, all four corners of the globe. They're really facing down the barrel of a challenging season, and certainly next year is a question. And so, to the extent that we can highlight these issues, we're happy to do it.
Okay. All right. I'll introduce you to one a friend of mine coined this term, but apocalyptimist. I'm not sure if that's going to apply, but I liked it. It has a ring to it.
It's up there with defensive pessimist.
There you go. Exactly. We'll do a tradesies there. All right. Listen, Doomberg, thank you again for coming back. I hope to make this kind of a regular occasion.
Sure, anytime.
It's been a blast as per usual.
Indeed, and direct all hate mail to Chris and all fan mail to the Doomberg account, and that would be great.
All right. Well, take good care, and we'll talk again soon.
Hey, can I at least get a plug in before we leave, or did we do that at the top?
It's plug away.
Just kidding, of course, but follow us at Doomberg T on Twitter and subscribe to Doomberg Substack at doomberg.substack.com. And I will say, big week for us. We are going to open up the paywall for Doomberg, and we're still going to be free for the month of April. But after that, we're going to be a paid newsletter. And this has really been an incredible journey for us. Thanks a lot for your help in promoting our work. And big week for us, and one that we are, let's say we're in the nervous doubt phase before you actually press go on one of these big projects. But ultimately, we're sort of optimistic that this will be the thing that we get to do for the rest of our lives. And so looking forward to that, and great timing for us to be on your show.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I don't think there's a better piece, for you to have launched before making that move. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to follow you behind the paywall, and all of us here at Decouple will be doing that. So good luck in that venture.
Indeed.
All right. Bye for now.
Thanks.